Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I am here again with Dr. Jim. We have talked a couple times before. We've talked about AI and healthcare and a couple related subjects, and it's always a tempting subject for us to go down that because that's something that we have a lot in common and that we like to discuss. But I want to be talking about Dr. Jim has a Substack that you should all check out. I'll put a link to that in the description. It's called Around the Corner. And he has been writing some stuff related to my polar bear ideas, David Bentley Hart's Christology lectures, which is another subject that I've been dealing with. And I should also just say, before we get going too far, is that everyone should check out the Midwestuary Conference that will be coming up in August 22nd through 24th in Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Jim will be there. So if in case you weren't excited enough, put that down as another reason to come to the conference to meet him in the flesh. And so we are, I will say a couple other announcements related to Midwestuary is we don't have an exact date yet, but there will be a date where the prices will go up. We're anticipating getting pretty near probably our capacity. And so maybe sometime in July or mid-July or something like that, the current prices will change and they will go up by a little bit. So don't get caught procrastinating. Buy your tickets now.
Excellent.
And if you are, and we also have some scholarship funding available, not a ton, but we still have some. So if that's something that is preventing you from coming or registering, you can email info@midwestuary.com to apply for that. But other than that, please sign up. Please get registered. Don't drag your feet or it might cost you. Or, we could even sell out and then it would extremely cost you and you will have missed out on the whole thing. So without any further ado, welcome, Dr. Jim.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
So like I said, Jim's been doing a lot of substacking and his Substack Around the Corner, which is, I think, a pretty clever name, obviously relating to this little corner, is criminally undersubscribed to at the moment. So definitely check that out. But I guess I'll sort of pass it over to you first in terms of what's been on your mind. What are you sort of most excited to talk about? I threw out, a couple things and you've been writing about very related topics to a lot of the things that I've been thinking about too. So I'll sort of let you pick our adventure, or at least where we get started.
Yeah. Okay. So I appreciate that. And thanks again for having me. I'm excited to be in Chicago. I'm glad to hear that there's interest with the lineup of speakers. It seems very likely that there's going to be a lot of interest. So I'm looking forward to that a lot. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, the corner has kind of evolved over time. Certainly there's a whole kind of new cohort of people, or maybe even two or three new cohorts of people that may not go back as far as my participation earlier on. But I'm interested in kind of being a little bit more present in the corner so that when I get to Chicago, I'll be able to interact with people in a richer way. And I've been trying for a while to kind of think through how I might do that. I'm not quite as able to participate in the live streams, particularly the midday live streams of Paul on Fridays. I'm working most of those days, and so just some changes in the way the corner has evolved have made it a little bit more difficult for me to participate. I do like this kind of format more. I like more of a kind of concentrated conversation than a freewheeling group conversation. So that's another reason maybe where I've drifted back a little bit. But there's other things. I think, like many in the corner, I both am very attracted to the environment, the culture, the community, but also feel myself to be in a different position relative to, let's say, the center of the corner. And part of the point of the Substack is still to kind of to try to position myself or outline that, bring forward that sense of where I stand, let's say down the street from the corner, in a sense. And that's part of what I want to try to get going in conversation as we head towards Chicago. And part of that is responding to you. Your YouTube channel has always been kind of my second preference in the corner, or perhaps sometimes first preference in the corner.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah. And part of the question that I asked as I was contemplating coming to Chicago and trying to work these ideas out was, why is that? I mean, why am I interested in a Unitarian talking about, deconstructing the development of the Trinitarian, dogma? How did I get to the point where that seemed to be interesting to me? And yet I watch every one of your videos on this, and it's kind of brought forward a kind of sense that I think of trying to understand my own posture relative to this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's partly because I think, in a way, and this is a little bit of a stretch, but in a way we have a similar position relative to the center of the corner, in that, as a Unitarian, you are in a position where, let's put it this way, part of, or maybe most of, the self-identity of a Unitarian is as a non-Trinitarian.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're constantly in a position to kind of look through and find the distinction between you and central ideas in the Trinitarian way of viewing things. And I'm sure that this happens to you, but it certainly happens to me, that someone will say something, I'm very intrigued and interested in it, let's say Paul Vander Klay, and yet it's a little kernel of an idea that in a certain sense I don't agree with. I don't. He's saying something counter to my own way of viewing things, and that just gets my ideas going. I want to develop that idea, and it ends up being kind of in contradistinction to what Paul is saying, let's say.
But still stimulated but still sort of stimulated and fertilized by what he was saying at the same time, even if you aren't in agreement with it. The own thoughts that you're having in disagreement with it wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been listening to him.
That's right. Exactly right. And so I found myself, maybe I was engaged with the corner for a long time without kind of noticing that fact about it, but then it became more clear to me, and I wanted to maybe develop that in more overt ways. And so in a way, the Polar Bear article is a little bit of that, but more in terms of an idea that you put forward. But if you look at my Substack, there are other ones that are like that. My take on Carlos Eire's "They Flew" is very much the model for this, because it raises an idea that Paul was very enamored with, that was a part of the discussion. Still, he brings up regularly, and yet I really have a very distinct way of understanding that sets me apart from that. And that Substack was a way of articulating that.
Yeah. So I guess we could talk about that first. So tell me a little bit. I mean, this is your most recent article that you wrote about sort of what you think about, They Flew, and what's causing you to view it a little bit differently than perhaps the mainstream discourse, and maybe just explain a little bit about what this book is and what it's about first.
Yeah, sure. So Carlos Eire wrote this book, They Flew. Carlos Eire is a Catholic historian, a well-respected Catholic historian, with a history of writing about, I think, the Reformation is one of his principal concentrations. Very well respected. But his effort in They Flew is a little bit of a unique kind of move that he makes overtly, to move into an area of talking about history in a very particular way, where he takes a a figure in history, a saint whose name is Joseph of Cupertino, who purportedly and became a saint because he was seen to levitate. This is in the 1600s, I believe. I'm not going to get any of the particular facts right because I need reference from other things to do that. But and it became a very a moment in the post Reformation era in Catholic Europe, particularly I believe in Spain, where there was a whole lot of events like this, miraculous and or supernatural events that were pointed to as manifestations of God in the world, let's say, and this levitation became a well-known event or series of events in the time frame. So it became a culturally known thing. So lots of people knew that Joseph was levitating, and there was controversy about it within the Catholic Church initially, but then they ultimately reviewed this in great detail, got witnesses, wrote them all down. In the process by which the Catholic Church justifies the beatification of saints, they developed a case for whether this was a legit, miraculous event or not. And ultimately, they did saint him. He became, people traveled to the monastery to be in the presence of this. And Carlos Eire's take on this is to make a claim like the challenging, I would say, the general modernist dogma about evidence for something, let's say empirical evidence for something, and that modernist frame would reject something like this levitation, and yet Carlos Eire wants to call attention to, there's a lot of evidence here. There's lots of witnesses. They wrote these things down. They adjudicated in certain, in some sort of a official way, in ways that seem to provide, let's say, as much evidence, if you count witness testimony of this type as evidence, of any other kind of phenomenon. And therefore, the modernist rejection of it needs to be called into question, because at least if the criteria for judgment here is going to be the preponderance of evidence. And so he raises that as a question. I'm not sure he ever goes to the point where he says, and this is part of my Substack, if you read it, he never quite goes to the point to say he is committed to the notion that Joseph levitated, but he's calling people's attention to this fact and writing an interesting history in which you would want to put yourself in the perspective of the era, of the moment, of the worldview of the day. And I take this to be, on the one hand, interesting and intriguing way to think about things, but I also think it plays into what I consider to be a recent kind of re-enchantment narrative in our own moment. And that this re-enchantment, there's a certain kind of mode of rhetoric that goes around this re-enchantment that I wanted to call into question, and I wanted to highlight. And I wrote another Substack to follow this, which I sent you a copy of, but I haven't posted yet because it's a little bit directed at Paul Vander Klay and his use of this type of rhetoric, of saying something like, wow, isn't it interesting that all these people see this weird stuff? The implication of a statement like that is, as such, we must take it seriously that it might happen, and yet not taking seriously the metaphysical implications of what that event would mean if it were to actually have happened. And more importantly than that, for me, the moral implications of what it would mean to readjust our metaphysical view of the world to incorporate something like levitation. And just to go to the pointed way in which I comment on this, there was more than simply what seems to be a benign levitation of a bit of an eccentric monk here. There were people who were labeled witches, one element of which one characteristic of a witch would be that they levitate, and that had serious moral implications on their lives and what people did. And I wanted to, let's say, dive into that conversation as to whether this re-enchantment conversation that people are in a way indulging in is not being taken seriously enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that is well said. I think that I actually haven't read Eyre's book, but I have heard it talked about a lot of times. I think even Ross Douthat mentioned it when
He
I
did.
was talking with him. And I think that you're absolutely right that the main thrust of the book, as far as I can tell from someone who's outside it and hasn't read it, does seem to be trying to poke at some of the central and underlying axioms of historical inquiry by using historical inquiry sort of against itself or something like that. And, like if you listen to Bart Ehrman and a whole bunch of other, say historians of Christianity of their ilk, they'll say, well, our modern historical methods are committed to philosophical naturalism or something like that. And maybe we can certainly say that a lot of people think Jesus rose from the dead and that they were inspired by that opinion, but we're not going to go all the way to say whether or not Jesus did rise from the dead, because that's in some sense a violation or an overextension of the methodology itself. And that I think what's interesting is that we do sort of need something like metaphysical axiomatic assumptions to do things like history at all. But that the tools that enable, things, enable you to see, but they might also have blind spots. And, like a lot of this is centered around sort of David Hume's ideas of, like, even if you hear reports of a miracle, the odds that a miracle happened are so low, and the odds of false reporting are higher than that. So you should probably basically never believe the reports of a miracle. I'm not articulating that as exactly precisely as he would have, but it's something along those lines. And even then, it's not exactly that he denies miracles from happening. He just basically says that the probability that a reported miracle is a false report compared to that it's true is high enough where you should probably disregard reports. He's not saying miracles can't happen. He's just saying from a purely probabilistic standpoint that you should assume that miracle reports are false. But then that gets to the whole point of, at what point could that be tested? Is there a time where the reports of the miracles are high enough where they can't be ignored? And I think that that's exactly what this book is poking at.
Right, but it's also doing so in a kind of rhetorical mode, which I wanted to call attention to, which is a kind of deal where it's kind of like there's a cadre of people behind Carlos Eire here, perhaps Paul Vander Klay is one of them, who are kind of winking at each other as this argument about the evidence for the events is kind of poking at the modernist worldview and taking a little bit of glee in the sense that might have the ability to kind of deconstruct that modernist viewpoint. And yet there's a lot of standing back and not necessarily committing to what would be the implications of such a thing if we were to actually take it seriously. It's one of the reasons why I liked the Joseph Cupertino example as opposed to more touchy ones like the ones that you mentioned, because we can be a little bit more forward. I can be a little bit more forward about asking the questions about it. I mean, why this miracle at this moment? What metaphysical implication does that have? What does that tell you about what you would purport to be the character of a God that would do such a thing, a random kind of seemingly arbitrary miracle like that? What does that tell us about the God that we are committed to? But then one more broader, even a more broader thing here, which is that part of what I think is a background kind of sense in the corner and beyond this, of course, this is part of this change, this sense that Paul is calling our attention to, that we're moving past the modern. And I think there's an element, there's a lot of that I'm not comfortable with. I would position myself within the corner, if I had the ability to do it, as a reactionary modern within the corner. In other words, I don't think we're moving past the modern. B, I don't think we should move past the modern. And C, I think that the toying around with moving past the modern is a very questionable. It
carries a lot of risks. Yeah. Too. I think that you're right, that a lot of this book, other things that are coming to mind are things like the telepathy tapes, which was
central part of my deconstruction of Paul's the next Substack, which I will post. I was hoping to get a reaction from Paul about it, but before I posted it, but.
And there does seem to be a fair amount of people who are sort of eager to cheer on the deconstruction of the modern. And if it's telepathy, if it's flying monks, if it is psychedelic demon encounters, then, bring it on, baby. It's time to move on. And the blind spots, the unaccounted for data in the modern system, the more that we can point to all of those different things, the faster it will fall down. And you're right that perhaps what's not being said is that there is some other metaphysical alternative that's being rooted for from the sidelines.
Yeah, and then this next piece that I'm trying to write right now, it would be formulated. One part of the argument would be formulated as follows, and that is that I think there's a kind of background presumption in a lot of the conversations here and beyond here, that it is just clear that the Enlightenment and the movement towards the modern consciousness is ultimately a kind of amoral thing, and that it strips any possibility of a kind of human-centered, ethically motivated process. And I think in the biggest picture, that's really not true. The history would, I think, support the following argument, at least in part, and that is that the Enlightenment and the move towards a more a suspicion of the supernatural, let's say, as part of that, was motivated by moral realities. It was motivated by, to be kind of strong about this, it was motivated by the failure of the prior worldview in many, many respects to keep constraint on humanity's worst impulses. And that was felt deeply in many, many dimensions and domains, not just the individuals who were mistreated, Servetus, witches, but in cultural facts, in terms of wars that were, at least in significant part, fought over distinctions that let's say metaphysical distinctions, theological arguments that ultimately were, let's say, indulgences of our worst nature. And so the Enlightenment and the modern movement is, in fact, at least in part, and I'm not saying it succeeded in this, but at least it was motivated, and it was motivated by moral commitments to real moral values.
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest real changes of modernism and maybe it's a little bit too easy for Americans to say this, but I mean, in many ways, the American political project is really sort of the full flowering and outgrowth of modernism and Enlightenment, taken to many of its logical, maybe not all of its logical, but many of its logical conclusions. And that I think that at the heart of what modernism was reacting against was that our political authorities throughout human history often rest, at least in some part, on the question of where is divinity manifested within the human frame. And that if divinity is something that sort of purely comes down from the top, then that kind of often results in things like monarchies or theocracies, or you can have, a monarchy over here and a church authority over here, and they have sort of different kinds of authority, but it's coming down from the top, and the divinity sort of first hits the top of the hierarchy, and then that gives it something of an unquestioned or unshakable authority, because what authority would there be to question it, except when it's perhaps being disloyal to its divine source or something like that. And maybe that's the sort of the voice of a prophet, is to be like, hey, you who's supposed to be acting on behalf of God, you're not, because God says this and you're doing this. But even then, it's to still a successful prophet reorients that, and then is kind of puts himself out of a job. And that this was causing all sorts of weird problems that can be inhumane in terms of mistreatment of heretics. I mean, I don't mean to harp on this. Like, it seems somehow too obvious for me to bring that up, but it is one of those things that was happening right there around the 1500s, was how to deal with heretics. Michael Servetus is perhaps the most famous example, but he's not alone either.
Yeah, no doubt.
And then other sorts of idea questioning, and then other sorts of, the Anabaptist rebellions and stuff like that. And why I think a lot of what modernism was the reorientation of the locus of where divinity manifests in humanity, from being the top of the hierarchy to being within everyone. And that was a huge amount of what the Protestant Reformation was about. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. When Luther's going around teaching about the priesthood of all believers,
There you go.
really what that is saying is that each individual person is sort of a locus of divine manifestation of authority. And that causes the complete reorientation of the political process from being a king speaking down to being the people lifting up. And that really, I think, it takes a couple hundred years to play out, but it's hard not to see the American process of that being worked out.
Absolutely. I do agree with you that the manifestation of the Enlightenment in the form, and it's going to be, I'm going to admit up front that I have my own bias here, because I'm an American and I grew up in this culture, and it's not just America. It's the historical event, let's say, of the formation of the Constitution. But it seems to me, embody, and you can use Tom Holland and say that it embodies Christian values in the form of the dignity of the individual, but it codifies it in a different way. It codifies it in a way that, and here's some fodder for people to make comments about. It formulates it in an anti-Christian way. The Constitution was written as a response, at least in part, as a response to the problem that everyone was dealing with at the time and for generations prior, in which the people who came over to the New World, they did not leave, they weren't leaving a wonderful, united Christian
Paradise
where everyone was taking care of each other. They left as Christians being persecuted by other Christians, and they left a world fighting itself over different versions of Christianity. And so I think there is there's a lot of complexity and nuance here, but it does seem to me that the Bill of Rights and the Constitution was a reaction to try and create a circumstance in which that was not the dominant way of looking at things. And I think it provisionally succeeded, perhaps as a manifestation of a historical change that was already going on, not because of entirely because of the brilliance of a few human beings, but as a progress that was going on. And in my mind, it's now, I don't know if this flows as well as it could, but it's not enough to just gesture at something like, as you're calling attention to the Re-enchantment, or as you're calling attention to the end of the modern, to just gesture in a clause of a sentence something like, "Oh, but of course I believe in, the Establishment Clause," or I believe in the freedom of religion. It's not enough to just gesture at that. For me, I have to be a full-throated believer in the values expressed there, and that's part of what I mean by being a reactionary modern in the
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is that you feel some people not being fully committed to the train of thought that they're writing, or a little bit like, there is a lot, especially in America, there is a lot built on those deep metaphysical assumptions, and if that gets overturned, then a lot of things that you might get overturned with it. Right. And it might be hard to predict which of those things falls. But if you're chopping at, the roots underneath you, or the branch that you're standing on, you might think that it might just make it a little bit easier to be a Catholic in the 21st century, to not have the Sam Harrises and Bart Ehrmans of the world trying to constantly undermine your faith. And so it feels a little bit nice to have a little bit of breathing room from some of that, but be careful what's underneath and attached to that as well before you start chopping it down too gleefully.
Right. That's one thing. Or maybe own the whole implication of what you're saying.
Yeah.
So, if you're going to say that it's interesting, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that lots of people said Joseph of Cupertino levitated, then maybe you need to take the next step and say, and I think he levitated too. And that means the metaphysics of the world is such that a monk in the 16th century can levitate. And that then means X, Y, and Z about what the structure of the world we're living in is.
Yeah.
And own the whole of it. And for me, again, I hope I'm not wandering too much, but for me, I'm a full-throated Christian, and I can say doctrines with conviction, without hesitation, despite what I've already said. And then, of course, people will say, "Well, wait a minute, how can you do that?" And I say, "Well, because I'm led by the Holy Spirit." And I'd say all the same things that everybody else would say about the way in which I internalize my relationship with Jesus Christ. And it, for me, doesn't run counter to any of the other things that I've just said. And you could ask me to try and elaborate how that would work out in terms of what I think of miracles in general and all that stuff. But but that would be just trailing explanations rather than kind of a centered faith that I have. And I don't think, see, now I'm getting myself a little confused, but I don't think that I want the faith that I have to put me in the position where I can't say something like, "No, levitation doesn't happen." It just doesn't. Now, of course, I'm saying that for myself. Everything I say is for myself, but nonetheless, it's the world in which I live. And my Christian faith needs to be in that world as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'll leave it at that there.
And it feels a little bit like Team Pro Re-enchantment is saying that if you want to be a Christian, you got to be on this side too. And that if you are saying, you know, actually I don't think he levitated, that you're sort of you know, I don't know, giving quarter to the enemy or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then this goes to all, and then this I find this to be the fun way of trying to elaborate this in this in the works that I'm doing in the Substack, as you know, trying to take each of these kind of areas one by one. So the notion of the modernism, the notion of liberalism, which I talked about a minute ago, as embodied in the Constitution. Here I'm talking about classical liberalism. I'm not buying the post-liberal thing, and nor do I think it would be a good idea for us to buy the post-liberal thing. And there's various versions of this that are kind of attractive to a lot of people. And I'm wanting to think that through for myself. And what I'm finding myself is that I'm a reactionary on a lot of those scores. And there's more than just that. I can't remember the list that I have, but there's a number of those that I'm interested in trying to express myself concerning.
Yeah, sure. So I'll read this paragraph that's from I think your last paragraph of the recent post. Re-enchantment is not a game. It is not an aesthetic flirtation or an intellectual provocation. It is, if taken seriously, a metaphysical revolution, one that affects not only how we see the world, but how we treat one another within it. If we are to reopen the space for the impossible, we must be prepared to govern that space with wisdom, compassion, and a deep moral seriousness about the cost of belief. And I think that is really that's really well said, and I think that's really sort of what you're getting to. And so what do you think are some of the moral costs or the moral risks that are on the table, because it seems like a pretty motivating factor for you?
Yeah, I think that another area is the let's say one half step back from the impulse to follow this line of thought is distrust in institutions.
Yeah.
And I think we're moving to a place where we're getting to the point of reckless disregard for the history that has brought us to the place that we're at, in terms of the value of these institutions. And now I want to reserve the right to be very nuanced about the value of those institutions, while so criticizing the institutions for their flaws and for their faults and for their failures. But I do feel like that we have a kind of a technocratic culture, which has lots of bad aspects to it. But at the same time, it is, in my mind, institutions that are capable of, let's say, institutionalizing compensation for those flaws.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and this, I think, is not just something that can be said of the institution of medical care, but it certainly, medical care is an example of how that can be an overall positive force, despite the fact that it includes the very, both natural and moral failings of humans in the very institution, and yet has created structures for reacting to that and at least possibly moving to a higher place as we confront those individual failures. And it's, in my mind, only institutions that can actually achieve that. And
Mm-hmm.
and so the example, for example, of the telepathy traits and the way in which autistic children, that whole story is an example of that. I can give many examples within medicine of failed treatments that are now looked back on as blatantly flawed to the point of injuring and harming our fellow human beings, but which were overcome, and that failed treatment was part of the institutional management of patients.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the institution itself was the only vehicle by which you could overcome that.
Yeah.
And if we were interested, we could talk about some examples of that. There are some obvious ones, but so I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah. So like, I do feel like, I mean, we've talked about this before, that hospitals, a lot of the old ones are named after religious denominations, or like Saint so-and-so's hospital, Presbyterian hospital, this, Methodist hospital, that. And then there, at a certain point in time, they started being named after universities, University of such and such, University Hospital, this, and this, as if the signifying that the credibility of the university had overtaken sort of the credibility of religious institutions. And now a lot of hospitals are becoming basically corporate brands,
yeah.
right? Where, especially as there's, a lot of consolidation among hospitals, that, and then they will get some new buzzword that is, a vaguely health related corporate jargon word. And then that's sort of the new brand of the hospital. That credibility went from religious institutions to universities to now just basically corporations. But it's like, to you, and how exactly is the care and all of the moral responsibility that it entails, as well as the process that is searching after the truth of which medicines work, which treatments work, if we are introducing a bad treatment, or if there's some sort of corruption in the medical process, like, an overprescription of opioids or whatever it is. That is, that one's just kind of a more of a classic case of just self-dealing or something like that. But it then eventually, I mean, but how do you expect that we could say, look, these are all the failures of the institutions, but it does seem to be what the institutions are aspiring to be, and the sort of moral undergirding of that we would hope for, that seems to be the only way for self-correction. And we still don't have some alternative vision for what a different sort of healthcare institution would be. Again, just picking healthcare as sort of a mutually relevant example, but there are all sorts of things like that. And it does seem like part of the reason why modernism is failing. Like, I think about a lot about this with respect to public schools and public education. I'm on the school board for my local public K through 8 school district. And it does seem like, we could, do all sorts of hand wringing about the over politicization, partisan, whatever ideological motivation within public education. And there's a lot about that that's really true. But it does seem to be kind of a symptom of a lack of faith in the original modernist project. And that there are these various things that are ready to fill the void that's being left by that.
Yeah. It's certainly possible. This is the way I'm going to think this through out loud. It certainly is possible that we are careening towards a cliff, or perhaps even not levitating as we fly off that cliff into a chaotic and dystopic future. In other words, I'm trying to paint the picture of, I hear the complaints, I hear the problem, the description of the problems, and I also hear in the description you're giving the kind of thesis of the root of our values needs to be honored, and nourished and kept in the center of our institutions. I'm entirely in agreement with that. I'm not quite as negative about our present state as others, I think, are, however. And it's partly, and that's not necessarily saying something as positive as it might sound, because I'm a little bit older than you are. I've been in medicine for now 40 years, 35 years. I've seen, and more than that, I've studied history to some degree, and I have an understanding of the failures that were part of the experience in the past. So I don't know that our crisis moment at the moment is any more dire than all prior eras in the past. And so that in a certain way gives me faith. If I tell a story of the development of antibiotic treatment of peptic ulcer disease, kind of getting a little nuts here, inside baseball, but it's a very interesting science story, because for many, many years, and it wasn't all that recent, it was 20 years ago. That doesn't seem like that long ago to me, but 20 years or so ago, it was dogma that peptic ulcer disease was caused by factors that we couldn't control other than the production of acid in your stomach and the diet that you ate. And people were told to eat bland diets and drink a lot of milk and avoid, certain things in the diet. It was completely ineffective. And a particular GI doctor came up with the idea that this might be caused by a bacteria. And everybody, he was quote unquote canceled. There was no doubt about it. He was ridiculed in public for presenting a paper at a prominent conference, and he suffered from that in terms of his career. And he was ridiculed in public by the president of the organization at the time. And a few years later, with some real research, it was discovered that he was correct, and it changed the management of peptic ulcer disease and helped a lot of people. And that very president basically reintroduced him into the community. I'm exaggerating the story a bit here, but this is basically the outline, and delivered a mea culpa later about that. And so before that, there was dogma that was harming people, and you could look at that and say, wow, that's bad. The institution is failing us. We should try something else, or we should trash the institution. And yet it was the institution in the end that
self-corrected.
Self-corrected. And there's many more stories like that. The management of breast cancer is another great example of this. And I can give you a slew of these, where if you put yourself in the frame of mind of the prior era, the management that was delivered previously, you would say, oh my, this is terrible. This is medieval, what we're doing, or what we did. And some of it was done corruptly. Some of it was done for self-interested reasons, harming people. So the worst of the worst that you can kind of describe, particularly in the case of breast cancer, we could talk about that if we were interested. But so really bad, and yet what would be the way out of that? Well, the way out of it is to continue to nurture and make the institution itself healthy. And that would be to include the values that are inculcated in that institution, and the broad, worldwide communities that come together and are checks and balances against each other, and conferences and universities and private medical institutions, all keeping, at least attempting constantly to keep the value, the higher values at the center of the activity, while noticing that we're failing to do that on an ongoing basis.
And I think that, returning to the question of whether monks can fly, it's sort of a question, well, maybe the idea that monks can't fly is a dogma that needs to be questioned, and that will use, quote, careful historical methodology to be like, well, look, by any reasonable standard, these monks seem to have been flying around. And so maybe we need to use that old modern standard of self-correction, of looking at the data and applying rigorous methodology to question that. But then, or is the question of whether or not monks can fly something that threatens the very apparatus of that self-corrective inquiry itself? And I think that that's sort of kind of at the heart of what this is the sort of methodological naturalism at some level that is the mechanism that needs to be, I don't know, kept, the integrity needs to be protected, that enables this sort of self-correction, that allows us to update our treatment of stomach ulcers when we've been wrong, update our treatment of breast cancer, update the way that we teach children how to read and teach them phonics and stuff like that, etc., without getting stuck in dogmatic, I don't know, rabbit holes or suboptimal locations.
Yeah.
Or do we need to use that methodology to consider the fact that people can levitate? I feel like that's
I would definitely say there's lots of nuance here, and there's lots to talk about. And I think that one of the things that Paul Vander Klay is right about is this, and more than one thing, he's right about a lot of things, but the idea of the lab leak idea,
yeah,
I think is one that would nuance my take here significantly. I think it is definitely true that there has been damage done by the extension of the modernist view to a kind of totalizing degree, and the kind of suppression of the validity of these other domains of our experience that are the domains where the values themselves reside and can be recognized and can be included in our valid and honored elements of our experience, and that has been destructive. That the notion that you get from the new atheist presentation, which is just one little eruption of this extremist version of the overweening kind of scientific world image, has been very destructive. And I would not say that you can't potentially attribute things like eugenics and the kind of terrible events of World War II, at least in part, towards that kind of kind of worldview getting overarching and penetrating too deeply into the consciousness of the culture. And so when I say what I was saying a minute ago, I'm not advocating the responsibility of making sure that we keep those values in the forefront of our decision making, and that, of course, does, I think, open the it opens the door towards a religious life. I believe, for me, a belief in Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and the images of kind of biblical values that I see expressed by people like Speak Life. What's his name? Justin.
Oh yeah, Scrivener, Glenn
Scrivener. His kind of catalog of the core Christian values. Hey, that's crucial and important, and I don't think that needs to be sacrificed. There's more to talk about there. There's lots of nuance there, but I do think that's true. I think that the kind of scientifically reductive worldview is itself a risk, a serious risk, and it has had negative impacts on our, our whole culture.
And that connects a little bit to the polar bears, because
There we go.
one of my points about the polar bears is that that basically, evolutionary biology is incomplete as commonly framed. Is sort of one of my main points when I'm talking about the polar bears, is that part of the methodology of the scientific inside the lab methodology is you don't talk about purpose, and you don't talk about anything too much like Platonic forms or any of that kind of stuff. You look at mechanism and you look at material substance, and you see how the balls move around and how they hit each other. And that evolutionary theory was like, okay, we've got genes, or even before Darwin didn't know about genes, but some hereditary mechanism, might not know what it is, but we'll just say there's a hereditary mechanism. But it's not like a 100% copy. There's some tweaks. And so you got hereditary with variation, and then there's differential and survival, and that changes things over time. And so therefore now we have this new insight into the mechanics and the physical processes of biology. But there's this kind of weird sentence that gets sort of left out, that doesn't fit within the system. And it's sort of the fittedness question. All right, so things survive because they're better fit. It's like, what exactly? That seems at one level like you're using a material description, right? Fit is like how one shape connects to another shape, right? That's what it sounds like. But the more you think about it, it's like, all right, define fittedness. Well, fittedness means that you survive better over time. So what you're saying is that the things that survive better over time will survive better over time. It's like that. It's not a very. You're basically just saying what will be if you're trapped within the sort of methodology of science. And so that's where my idea of the form of the polar bear, this idea that yes, there's a mechanical cause, yes, there is the form, yes, there is the mechanical or material cause, and the other ones I'm forgetting. Sorry, Aristotle, but that
formal cause, probably
formal cause.
Yeah, formal cause would be the ones. Yeah.
Yes, there's the stuff that you're made out of, and then the energy that made the mechanical cause, and then the material cause. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, but that they're
leaving out the final cause, which is of course an important point.
Leaving out the final cause,
yeah,
which is polar bears are white so that they don't get seen. Polar bears are fuzzy so that they're warm in winter. Female polar bears dig a den so that they can have a baby in a warm, comfy place away from the cold, and then they emerge in springtime so that it's starting to warm up and there's finally some food around, so that for the purpose of, because, in order to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden you can't explain anything in biology without using all of this purpose language, which was supposed to be verboten from the get-go. And that's one of my things, is that I am sort of poking the modernist framework, saying that it can't do what it's trying to claim that it can be doing.
I think in my article there, and I wrote two of these. I think in my article there, in a way I'm allied with you on this, but I come at it from a little bit of a different perspective. I say something like that there is a vision of the world that the scientist would have us cast our view on the world with, in which all that we are seeing are effects. And therefore they all, or originate in cause, but those causes are also effects, and we're bound in a causal network. In order to do science, in a certain sense, you have to put that hat on. You have to see the world in that way. And that is by nature. And this, if people are interested, they could go back to my conversation with Paul Vander Klay way back, in which we talked about a philosopher named Wilfrid Sellars and the scientific and the manifest image. And this is the kind of argument I'm making now. And that is that worldview, that scientific worldview of the world being caught up in a causal network, is by its very nature is totalizing. It's basically must be the case that everything has a direct, immediate cause in order for the whole thing to be coherent. And we see, well, let's see, let me move quicker through this. That view of things is, on the one hand, very, very potent, very, very important. And I don't necessarily agree with those who want, and I maybe point to Jonathan Pageau here, want to say something like, it's just one perspective amongst many. I think it's a very privileged perspective. I think it's a very important perspective, but it's a limited perspective. Even though when you put that hat on, or you go into that scientific room and look at the world with that view, it is totalizing. It's trying to cover every element of the world that is being investigated with that thought process. Just to reiterate, it is a very powerful and therefore privileged way of looking at things, and is something that we should honor as a very important thing. No. But it does not account for our human experience. It does not. And therefore there is the responsibility of all of us to inhabit what Wilfrid Sellars calls the manifest image. That is to say, the reality of our own engagement with it, and the values that we carry into that, imperfectly grounded and understood and articulated, but nonetheless, absolutely and utterly critical to bring to bear on our decision making. And the idea that we would let the scientific image kind of crowd out our own kind of engagement and personal humanistic engagement with the world, first off, it's not necessary, and secondly, it is our responsibility not to let that happen. And and I would say, and I personally use the Christian narrative as the way in which that foundation has its articulation. That ethical foundation has its articulation. And so I don't know. That's my take on that. And I have, I don't know if you want to comment on that. I have another little vignette that I like to throw at this one, but
yeah, I think.
Sorry, one more.
Go ahead.
But in terms of the way in which you are approaching this, so the way I wrote those articles was to say, well, look, we have to put that hat on. And when we put it on, we can't play games with it. And this is what I think Richard Dawkins is doing. He's playing games with it. Put the hat on and be serious about it. And if you do that, you're going to end up with an empty universe.
Yeah.
And so then you have to face the implications of that. And once you face that implication, you realize, well, look, we don't live in an empty universe. He himself admits that. He values Bach and Mozart, and he recognizes the values that we all, I hope, we all want to, kind of be the manifestation of in our world. And so don't talk as though you can bring it out of that image, or that you would banish kind of millennia of efforts by humans to bring to bear appropriate human values that religious traditions, Christianity for my part, in its best, have brought into our experience and our wealth of resource to maintain them.
Yeah. So I think I'm getting more clear on what you're saying.
Yeah.
That there is this scientific perspective that perhaps can get overly, I don't know, worshipped, one might say, and forget that it is grounded in something bigger. And so that's a mistake.
In something bigger, yeah.
Nothing, reliant on something larger than itself for its own coherence. But that there does seem to be perhaps too strong or enthusiastic of a push from the Re-enchantment crowd, say, to cheer the dethroning of the privileged place that we have given that perspective in the modern culture that was a product of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and the modern transformation of epistemology and culture and authority and knowledge making. And that if we were to forget how powerful and useful that is, it is the thing that tells the doctor who's in charge of the Society of Doctors that if he's not honoring it when someone says, actually, I have a better theory about what's causing the stomach ulcers, it might be the bacteria. Let's take a look at that, and that could help us treat these patients better. You need to have a respect for that spirit, that authority, that perspective, to be willing to challenge yourself instead of hanging on to your prestige, your credibility, all that's wrapped up in the previous status quo, right? And it is a very rare thing. It's way too common in human culture and human history to not respect the critique, to not respect the correction, to not humble yourself before truth that might be different than what you're currently thinking. Yeah. And that is, respecting the doctor who has the new idea. It's respecting Galileo and what he has seen through his telescope. It's respecting Servetus when he goes to Geneva to tell Calvin that he thinks he's wrong, etc. And that if we are too quick to kind of swing pendulums in the other direction, that we might lose the fact that that's not just one perspective among many, but it's an extremely important perspective, even if we have to remember that it is limited and nested in something larger.
Yeah. Yeah. And let me just point the critique that I would have for your approach to this as a way of making a point, making the same point. And that is that it feels to me like what you're trying to do is find in the scientific image the source of something, or a signpost of something that would be the grounding of that kind of value structure, let's say.
Yeah.
And my point is, I don't know that you're going to find it there, and that that draws your attention, let's say, away from we just got to do this. We just got to do this like we've always had to do it. We always have faced the problem of the is-ought gap. We've always dealt with the fact that our that the world seems deterministic, and we seem to inhabit it, and yet we are responsible for our fellow human beings in many ways. We've always faced that, and we need to continue to realize that's where it is. It's right there. It's not going to come from elsewhere. It's just going to come from us. It's going to come from our own our own effort, our own faculty, our own capacity to, kind of recognize the good, justify our actions. And so the scientific image is going to be out there as a problematic reality that seems to encroach on that, but we need to, keep our attention on the values that we know now. It's very complicated. It's very nuanced, because when I say that, it's like, but wait a minute, we've constantly failing at that, and we're failing at it right now. And so it's definitely a difficult thing to try to achieve in actuality, but it's also present in our world. This is part of my complaint about we got to move past modernism, or we are moving past modernism. It really is the case that that many of our institutions, which guide themselves on a technocratic kind of effort to be kind of following the rules and making up rules to follow, it really is the case that most of those, if you look at them closely, are motivated by good people and good histories of people applying themselves to the police department, or to the highway department, or to other kind of institutions trying to do their best, trying to avoid the bridge that's going to collapse. That they're not, people aren't so without recognition of those values in our present world. And so it seems to me like we're skipping over and not recognizing that enough, that behind the use of the modernist frame is actually a real kind of motivation of ethical behavior, if imperfectly manifest.
Mm-hmm. And that, so trying to find the transcendent by using the scientific frame or something like that is put kind of a cart before the horse, or a little bit backwards, right? If I'm using, evolutionary biology kind of as the highest thing to try and rejigger a new metaphysics or something like that.
That's my complaint. Yeah.
Yes.
That's my complaint.
That then there's something about that's fundamentally upside down, and that is similar to recognizing that the scientific frame is kind of underneath a lot of people's intrinsic motivation to do the right thing. And that this is something that's always sort of been within us. You're not saying that we're perfect or something like that, or that we can't be motivated by bad motivations too, but it's sort of, failing to recognize a lot of what's been driving the whole thing the whole time anyway, or something like that.
Yeah. And that we are the wielders of tools. We are the wielders of technology. We are embodied in a world that, and that means we are the wielder. That is to say, we are given the capacity, hopefully competence, ability to recognize the good. I mean, if someone were to try to claim that we do not have the ability to recognize the good, that's a scary world. And again, I'm not able to talk about it or say what the good is right now, or undo the fact that the good now in our present context seems to be very different than the good was seen to be, 500 years ago. All of those difficulties are just ever present and can certainly lead you to feel that this competency that I'm trying to generate confidence in is unjustified. But I'm not sure we have anything else
ready as backup, ready as an alternative. Yeah. I think that is right. That I do feel a lot about this in the kind of the discourse on moving beyond liberalism and that sort of thing. It's like, I have yet to hear any good plausible alternative. It's like, right. Catholic integralism, no thanks. Yeah. Marxism, no thanks. Yeah. Some kind of power fascism, no thanks. Some kind of, neo-Calvinist Christian nationalism, no thanks. And that there really doesn't seem to be a good imagination of the alternative. It sort of feels a little bit more like, that liberalism and the Enlightenment did a lot of its best work already, and that we're growing impatient with it, and that when it sort of slows down, it's easier to highlight the bad problems and not be as thankful for the good things, and that it fosters a sort of kind of impatience and ingratitude.
And also a kind of, I think, a real kind of deep existential worry about where we're at. Here's one example, just to maybe be less pushing against the flow of the corner. I've understood and followed Benjamin Boyce discussions of the transgender kind of ideology and that whole experience, that is deeply troubling.
Mm-hmm.
And then to have a government that would project a rainbow flag on the White House, that feels like we're approaching some really bad territory.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't discount the real problematic nature of the way where we've come to, let's say. Now I can paint the same troublesome picture from the other side of the political perspective and frankly feel just as troubled by it. And so I don't know. This is what I meant when I said before, the future is unknown and we could be heading towards, the last scene of the Joker. That might be where we're going. I don't know. But it seems to me that the best answer to that is to look around and say, well, look, we're doing some good things here and there and be part of that and keep doing it. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. But I do feel like you've given a little bit of a cause for optimism too, in that, it's not like we haven't had problems before, right? If the transgenderism thing is sort of an example of kind of a supernaturalism that crept in and asserted itself and didn't want to be questioned, being, to even claim such a thing like someone could be born in the wrong body is a very loaded metaphysical, there's a whole lot of baggage going on alongside that thing that is, outside the realms of naturalism. But there have been lots of claims before, especially, within medicine about things. I don't know. I'm trying to think of electroshock therapy or something like that, where some really kind of kooky, weird, and bad ideas dominated for a long time and did a lot of harm. And so at some level, we shouldn't be too discouraged that some of these problems are completely new or unprecedented, and have a little bit more faith in the process of self-correction.
Yeah. And also just embody the positive of it. I work I work with patient care on a daily basis. It's nowhere close to being perfect, but for the most part, it feels to me, and I'm not perfect at making self assessments of the entirety of the institution that I work in, but it feels to me like for the most part, everybody's motivated to try to help, to try to do good things, and it's not just healing. It's not just overcoming physical ailments. It's caring. It's nursing care. It's being with and caring for people. And, I would encourage people to, maybe lots of people have, but be in a hospital for a while. There are a lot of very competent people doing, they're getting paid for it. It's a good thing that they're getting paid for it, but they're trying. Everybody's motivated mostly, for the most part, by the impulses that we would find honorable.
Yeah.
And we need to
same in a public.
I would bet it's the same for a police force. I would bet that it's the same for, an engineering group that's working to build the roads, and the guy who's on the side of the road, directing traffic. It's not like everybody's perfect, but they're trying to do their job the best they can. And that is, in the end, motivated by these values that we can encourage. And anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And same for, I was just going to say, a public K-8 high school,
there you go.
Elementary, middle school. A lot of the teachers, most of the time, same thing. They're really trying to teach the kids well.
Yeah. And they have lots to fight against, and I'm sure you're trying to help with that. And the transgender thing is hopefully on the wane, and then we can look back and say, wow, that was a disaster, but we're past it. But maybe not. I don't know. I don't know the future. It could all fall apart. You never know. But and I think your participation in the public schools, that's I can see how that would be problematic in a lot of ways, but at the same time, maybe there is some hope there too.
Yeah, but even then, most of the time, a school board is just voting on things like how much money should we spend to fix the broken HVAC system this year? Right? Like, and we're like, okay, well, we could hire this contractor or this contractor. Should we spend, this amount of money or this amount of money? And we're, everyone's there trying to do the right thing and figure out, the constraints of the situation and hope that we don't regret what we did a year from now when we're looking at the same HVAC system that's broken again. Right. So yeah, like that's a majority of the work of being on a school board. It's not constantly battling about rainbow flag issues or something like that.
Yeah. And I don't know. My wife will always say when I talk like this, that somehow it comes across that I'm a kind of, glass half full all the time kind of guy.
Yeah.
It's not really what I mean though. It's more that it's an ongoing battle. It's a real battle. And but the battle is to notice that the glass is half full.
Yeah.
Because if you think it's empty, it seems, I like, there's lots of things I like, but the parable of the Good Samaritan is I think a really good illustration of what I'm trying to get at here, because, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of people in that story that are neglecting the very thing that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And Jesus points us to this one moment where the Samaritan recognizes that impulse, that need, that demand on him to act on this, the love of Jesus Christ, let's say. And if you imagine the world that parable is describing, in which the Samaritan failed and walked by the ditch, and that was the end of the parable. That's the world, so the world is bad to start with. There's religious people with deep religious knowledge walking past the guy in the ditch. There's the guys who put him in the ditch. There's, et cetera. You would have a pretty bleak world.
Yeah.
And yet the Samaritan doesn't fix it all. It doesn't change the fundamental situation, but you still recognize that without that as a possibility, as a reality, we'd be living in a pretty bleak place.
Yeah. So it seems like kind of a summarizing theme of what you're trying to say is that there's a fear of a collective sense of loss of faith in the goodness of a lot of what we're doing already, and that it works better than we think, and that we could regret it when we're gone. And a lot of this re-enchantment sort of cheering might be on the side of cheering against the collective faith in what we're already doing right.
Yeah, I think that's a decent summary. Yeah.
Yeah. I hope to, I really hope this conversation comes together. I've been having a heck of a time getting on the schedule, but having Rod Dreher and Bethel McGrew on to debate whether or not re-enchantment is a good thing or a bad thing.
Hey, there you go.
Right, and I think you and Bethel McGrew are in similar corners of the.
We are. When I did dip into one of the live streams that was on the topic of the Carlos Eire book, she was there at the time, and we resonated a little bit because I said I'm a humanist, and she said I'm a humanist too.
Yeah.
So yeah. I subscribed to her Substack. I've enjoyed her stuff for a long time.
Yeah. Well, she'll be at Midwestuary, so something great to look forward to. But I think that this is helping me too, because like even in my videos where I'm like trying to make sense of Pageau and Vervaeke, right? My like ontology of the spirit videos, I still can't help but like lean in the direction of trying to make this make sense in some sort of semi-modernist kind of framework. Right. My inclination is even like, all right, so Vervaeke is talking to someone named Hermes. What's going on? How are we supposed to make sense of this? Right. How can we kind of sort of shoehorn this back in without completely being unfair, denying what's going on? And yeah, that is one of those things that's testing the framework a little bit. There's not supposed to be invisible people out there named Hermes who suddenly grab your attention all of a second. But how do I be faithful in respecting that and trying to talk about it in a way that, I don't know, is doing everything a little bit of justice?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's yeah, I mean, your two-part deal on the spirit inspired me to think about a Substack post, which I'm going to hopefully get to after the one I'm working on right now, in terms of this notion of the vocabulary that Jonathan Pageau is wanting to bring forward, and that Paul Vander Klay brings forth when he talks about the spirit, let's say the spirit of the high school, high school spirit or school spirit. And the question that comes raised in my mind, again, this is this kernel of an idea that gets me to think, and it ends up in this deal where I feel like people in the corner are going to say, "Oh, there goes Dr. Jim again. He's throwing cold water on everything." But the idea is, why do we need to? We have the vocabulary. That is to say, Paul Vander Klay is telling us, is using the example of school spirit because we recognize that.
No,
it's not like that word is, it's not like Sam
it's
Harris.
Not that, yeah, that's not a data point that doesn't fit already.
Right. Exactly. It's not like Sam Harris would say, wow, you're saying something irrational when you say that the school has spirit. So the question is, what is the difference in what is being pointed to, let's say, by Paul Vander Klay's pointing to school spirit and Jonathan Pageau pointing to something similar like school spirit, but he kind of means something different, right? He means something more. He means something deeper or something more. I don't know. You get to articulate that. And the question is, how would you navigate that? Why do we need a new vocabulary?
Yeah. And is there something missing or wrong already?
Right.
Yeah. I should get going in just a little bit, but I think I'll pass over to you. Do you have any sort of concluding thoughts or any other things that you wanted to get off your chest?
Not really. That was, I was able to express a lot of the ideas that are interesting to me. I hope I didn't kind of run over a lot of opportunity for you to speak, but
I mean, I can speak on my channel anytime I want. So I'm happy to try and help my guests figure out what they have to say and to try and learn from them. That's my goal for these things.
And I appreciate the opportunity for that. I have lots of ideas. I have an idea, and I'll just throw this out there, of talking to Chad about music. And it's and there's been this little hint that we might want to talk about music occasionally, going back years. And I'd like to maybe do, I don't know if he's going to be at the conference or not.
Yeah. Chad the alcoholic.
Yeah,
absolutely. Chad's one of the key organizers of the conference.
Excellent.
Yes. And
so
in fact,
I'd like to talk to him about music. I'm going to try to inspire that. Do you have if you could send me his contact?
I'll give you his contact information for sure.
I'm wanting to do little things like this in order to kind of
help get your face back out there again and re-enter. Get back on the field. Yeah.
And I have some other ideas as well, but I really appreciate the opportunity today. Julian was one also that I was looking forward to talking to. Julian and I kind of had a connection way back as well. He's a David Bentley Hart fan, I think, and at least was back then. He actually talked to him. He interviewed him about his one book. I don't know if you remember that way back, but so Julian's another. I'm interested to hear an update on how things are going for Julian, because he was young then, and he's not quite as young now. So.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, I mean, I should give Chad even a little bit more credit. He actually got the ball rolling on the whole conference.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Wow. He sent out the initial invitations to our current list of speakers. He named it Midwestuary. He named it themed it the Fellowship of the Spirit. Those are things I inherited from him. So excellent. Just to give credit where credit is due. And so, yeah, he'll be there. So anyway, but Dr. Jim, good to talk with you. I really appreciate it. And I need some poking and some correcting, and an occasional bath of cold water is what all of us need from time to time. So there's nothing wrong with that.
Thanks again, Sam.
Thank you.